my name is Ryan, and as previously mentioned, I compiled this history on Bowman, more specifically his map and the people and places described therein as part of a practicum I did for the library last year. And I have very kindly been asked to reiterate it to you tonight in this wonderful presentation. So if we can go to the first slide, I can tell you exactly who was Alexander Bowman. He was a carpenter, secretary for a teachers association, architect and surveyor who moved his whole family from New York to Illinois to further his educational and business prospects in the 1850s, despite his persistent health and financial issues. Some of the materials and edifices he created remain extant to this day, thankfully, although they do not always add up to tell a complete life story. His name is not well known by other cartographers, and he was not included in the list of official county surveyors in Cunningham's History of Champaign County. His is a name that appears irregularly on various forms of paper throughout the second half of the 19th century. There is a census record indicating his move to West Urbana in 1857, a series of advertisements for his skills as an architect and civil engineer published in the Central Illinois Gazette and other newspapers, and a PACA record verifying him as the designer of the fourth iteration of the county courthouse, which stood until 1901 at the cost of $30,000. Bowman is believed to have died in 1907. Next slide, please. And so continuing on from that, the Champaign County Board approved Bowman's architectural plans for the expansion and fireproofing of the courthouse, and his specifications for the building were published in the Our Constitution newspaper on August 27th, 1859. This fourth iteration was supposed to be in addition to the 1848 brick courthouse, but when construction began that year, the former courthouse was razed to its foundations, leaving only one wall standing, and a new fireproof building was built in its place. The designs were completed in 1861 and stood until another remodeling designed by Joseph Royer and Frederick Gage Brown took place in 1901. On the right side, you will see two images, and this is how Bowman is known best to those of us at the Champaign County Historical Archives, because he created these two prominent early maps, one of Urbana and West Urbana and one of Champaign County. Both maps feature drawings of significant homes and buildings along their borders. The 1858 map is notable for its use of West Urbana, as the town's name would be changed to Champaign in only 1861, a few years later. The 1863 map serves as an early plat map of the county and is consulted regularly by both staff and patrons. Bowman and his family moved once again to neighboring Vermilion County, where he found work as the county surveyor for 35 years and served 3 terms as their city engineer. Upon his death, he was memorialized by the Champaign Daily Gazette under the headline, "Died in Danville Wednesday." The architect of the old Champaign County Courthouse was his most famous epithet. Having been one of the oldest masons in the state, the society was in charge of his funeral processions. Long after his death, one of his descendants, Jim Bowman, donated 2 of his journals to the Champaign County Historical Archives in May 2017. Next slide. Now, before I go deep on the exact specifications of the map, I need to establish some context about what Champaign Urbana was like in the year 1858 when the map was created. In that year, the towns were a burgeoning center of enterprise and opportunities. The dark days of the economic panic of 1837, which had heavily lowered agricultural prices and halted the route of westward expansion through the state, were long gone, and 4 years of settlement around the train depot had resulted in the West Urbana Township that would become Champaign proper. The pages of the Urbana Union newspaper from its annual issues show that county residents were reading a mixture of advertising, serialized stories, and political current events. These ads were selling land, liniments, clothing, and horses. The stories were full of historical fiction set during exciting eras, such as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre and the Revolutionary War. Other stories focused on wilderness survival and exploration, or else had more domestic settings with women as their main characters. Current events included strong opposition to the pro-Lecompton Constitution of Kansas during its Bleeding Kansas era of political strife, strong endorsement of Illinois Congressman Owen Lovejoy and Stephen A. Douglas, and political excerpts that had occasional mentions of a rising political figure named Abraham Lincoln, who at the time was trying to win control of the Illinois General Assembly from Douglas in a series of famous debates. That fall, the county would play host to a meeting between Lincoln, William Brose, and Judge Terry of Danville. Next slide. And so this here is the map itself. It is notable for the use of its term West Urbana at the exact moment of expansion westward. The Illinois Central Railroad was originally supposed to lay track in Urbana proper, but they chose to lay it 2 miles further west than they'd originally planned because the land was flatter there. The Depot Township developed around this spot and was officially incorporated in 1855. It grew so substantially that only 5 years later, it was able to rechristen itself as Champaign. After its founding in 1833, I momentarily lost my place, I apologize. After its founding in 1833, the 1850s were the busiest decade of growth for Champaign-Urbana history at the time, with a population boom of 2,600 in 1850 to 1,400 and 1,600 in 1860, largely as a result of this railroad presence in the West. Bowman's map remains a significant cartographical landmark for the county because of this, in its ability to capture a specific temporal moment of massive growth in the form of detailed land ownership and vignettes of local life. It is also significant because only a few copies of the map have been known to survive into the present day. 2 of them are located in the Urbana Free Library, one of which used to be displayed in the former city building on Elm and Broadway. That would be restored and reframed in 2005 and is now proudly framed outside the Champaign County Archives. The 3rd copy is held by the British Library, where it was considered for placement in their Magnificent Maps exhibition in 2010. Next slide. So around the borders here, you can see that the map offers an overwhelmingly positive view of the Twin Cities of local life for its most notable residents and principal civic buildings. While many features of early Urbana Champaign are still recognizable today, there have unsurprisingly been some changes made to various names, buildings, and locations. What used to be high and dry streets in Urbana are now high in Illinois. The spelling of Neal Street with an A changed to Neal Street with an I, sometime between 1858 and 1884, when the bird's eye view map of Champaign was produced. And that is the map to the right in the first set of images. The Cattle Bank building is the only building represented in the 1858 map that is still standing. Since its construction circa 1856, it has housed banks, manufacturing plants, drugs, and grocery stores, as well as a pharmacy. In 2002, the property found life once again when it became the new home of the Champaign County History Museum. It remains the oldest standing building to this day. Next slide. So in the positive view that Bowman sought to depict in his map, he had to find the town's most prominent citizens to feature. And to fulfill this criteria, he went for men with prominent roles in the community or respected jobs. These would be lawyers, doctors, clerks, agriculturists, or pioneers, all of whom had established Urbana's judicial and economic landscape dating back to the 1830s. His inclusion of individual homes visually prioritized on the same level as the civic buildings would have pleased these wealthy landowners, knowing that their stature was equal to the civic buildings. Each picture shows a person or enterprise in their most idyllic setting possible, whether it's the beautifully kept lawn of Alonzo Campbell in the upper picture, or Pratt and Brothers enjoying a prosperous day of work with their lumber in high demand in the lower picture. These margins are where Bowman diverged from recreating the realistic confines of the town's geography to creating idealized images that convey the city's sense of accomplished civility. This is not accurate to every citizen's lived experience at the time, but it does reflect a proud desire to show Urbana and West Urbana as prosperous emerging towns in the heartland of Illinois. Next slide. And here we have one of those buildings now with angled block, which stood on East Main Street in Champaign, no longer standing, unfortunately, for reasons I will soon get into. John Harrison Engle and Charles W. Engle were a brother duo of businessmen from New York. They arrived in West Urbana in 1856 and established a dry goods store in a group of buildings that became known as Engle's Block through their properties. Timothy H. Toby was a proprietor of West Urbana's first tailoring establishment and was also located in this block of buildings. The eldest brother, John, died suddenly of typhoid fever in February of 1860, with his obituary describing him as one of the most prominent and energetic businessmen, and his store hailed as a leading firm in the town and county. Upon John's death, Charles closed the dry goods store. The middle picture is an advertisement for such stock of goods, and the image to the right is a cartoon that was published in the Urbana Courier many years later by an artist named James F. Zumwalt, who had a weekly feature in the magazine in which his pen and ink drawings depicted scenes from the past century of county life. The date in it is inaccurately stated, but I don't think Zumwalt particularly cared for that oversight. All right, next slide. Onto Bailey's Buildings / Bailey's Hall on the corner of North Neal and West Church in Champaign, also no longer standing, and with its replacement burning in 2008. The Bailey Building was originally a large frame commercial building constructed for David Bailey in 1857. He was a pioneer settler of West Urbana who settled after moving from New Hampshire as a young man. He had general stores in Champaign, Vermilion, Piatt, and DeWitt counties. In addition to his general store, the Bailey Buildings hosted Daniel Rugg's boot and shoe store, which was a first for the county. In 1871, Bailey and Rugg worked together to create a 3-story brick building in the Italianate style on the same site. This impressive building, with its elegant round-headed windows, limestone trim, and 20-foot ceilings, hosted stores on the first floor, offices on the second, and a meeting hall on the third. This new building became known as the Metropolitan Building, which burned in November of 2008, and that space is currently occupied by the Hyatt Place Hotel. Daniel Rugg is the gentleman in the third picture with the very fine facial hair. And then the Metropolitan in the rightmost image, built in 1871, stood for many years, housing many sites. Original site of Robeson's drugstore. A descendant of Rugg, Robert Hamilton Tilden, successfully applied for it to be included in the National Register of Historic Places in 1997. Next slide. And now for the cattle bank, where I can describe the very walls that enclose you. Still standing, of course. In 1858, the cattle bank began operations in a 2-story brick building that had been the temporary West Urbana location for a branch of the Grand Prairie Bank since 1856. It got its name originally by providing banking and loan services to the cattle raisers who drove their herds to Champaign in order to ship them on the Illinois Central Railroad line all the way up north to the Chicago beef market. However, the bank dissolved 3 years later due to a cattle variant importing cattle who were found to have hoof and mouth disease, causing the entire central Illinois cattle industry to collapse almost instantaneously. The building was resurrected in 1865 by Nicholas Miller to be the site of his mineral water manufacturing plant, after which time it was leased out as a drugstore. It operated as the McGraw family grocery from 1893 to 1936, and William Q. Sink's local pharmacy from 1936 to 1951, before reaching its final commercial iteration as Heimlicher Sundries from 51 to 1971. Unfortunately, that same year, a devastating fire swept through the premises, ending the sundries business and the practice of housing tenants in the building that had been in effect for 110 years. In 1975, the Preservation and Conservation Association of Champaign County successfully added the bank to the National Register of Historic Places, spearheaded in a campaign by Joan Severns, a Champaign City Council member and future Champaign mayor. In 1978, her efforts were rewarded when the city purchased the building using funds from a federal community development grant. The building was renovated and housed the Champaign County Housing Authority. In 2002, the property found life once again when it became the new home for Champaign County Historical Museum. Next slide. Now we get into the Doan House, which stood on the corner of Main Street. The Doan House was a 3-story square building with a wing off the north side. It was built in 1856. It was 34 feet wide, or apart from the railroad tracks, and it served as a hotel and ticket office / depot for passengers for 42 years. It was the center of West Urbana life, a gathering place for residents and visitors. It hosted church services, social events, and political discourses. Proof of the building's status in the community can be seen in local advertisements. Individual street addresses were not used in Champaign until the 1880s. Therefore, it was the custom of local advertisers to refer to new or smaller businesses in reference to a well-known location, and the Doan House was a common reference point for this purpose, as seen in one of the clippings on the page. On July 12, 1898, the Doan House was completely destroyed by fire. Residents were saddened by the loss of this historic building, but after 42 years, it was showing its age and no longer being used as a hotel since the operator's lease had recently ended. Once the ashes of the fire had cooled, however, the population of Champaign was interested in what the railroad company would replace it with. That interest never bore as much interesting fruit, however. The 98 picture of citizens watching the burning can be seen on the right-hand side of the slide. Next slide, please. Now we get into the commercial buildings, which were on West Main Street between North Race and North Broadway, which was then known as Market in Urbana. None of these are standing any longer, unfortunately. In the 1850s, Urbana consisted of the courthouse and 75 other residential and commercial buildings, primarily one-story frame dwellings within a quarter-mile radius of the courthouse as the town's center, essentially. The Main Street commercial buildings, according to Joseph O. Cunningham's history, were built in response to the platting and development that was going on in West Urbana post-installation of the depot. A row of primitive log and frame buildings were torn away in the 100 block of West Main and replaced with 2-story business houses, 1 room for a bank, and 6 rooms for store, all of which were once occupied. The tenants consisted of Grand Prairie Bank and J.D. Wilson's Harness Shop, J.W. Jakewith's Drug School, the Urbana Constitution Printing Office, New City Bakery, and general stores run by Clapp and Gear and Alonzo Lyons. The notice for Jakewith is the picture in the bottom right, lower than Clapp and Gear, and then above it, Jakewith. All right, next slide, please. As for the Methodist Episcopal Church, now the First United Methodist Church on 304 South Race Street, it is still at this location, even if the original building no longer stands. It holds the distinction of having been the first church building in the county, built in 1840 from timber. The pastor and congregates measured it to be 30 by 40 feet, initially located on Elm, as well as lacking windows and doors, not finished until 1843. In 1856, the congregants embarked upon a new church building project at the corner of Green and Ray Streets, where the church is presently located. This brick structure with a tall white frame steeple was dedicated in 1858 by Reverend Peter Cartwright, a pioneer circuit rider and evangelist, and is the building illustrated in the Bowman map. The church underwent another revision in 1892 to accommodate the growing size of the congregation. This third version of the church was known as the Sheldon Memorial Church because it was made possible through a generous donation from Jarius and Eunice Sheldon in memory of their son, Clarence C. Sheldon. The present structure was constructed in 1925 and dedicated in 1927. It was designed by a local architect as well as a member of the Methodist congregation, Weimer M. Maxwell. The Sheldon Memorial Chapel is the middle picture in the sort of middle of its stage. The left-hand side is as it was originally drawn in the 1850s. And the right-hand picture is the cover of a dedication program for the First Methodist Episcopal Church in 1927. Next slide, please. Now for the Parks Flooring and Sawmill, north of West Water Street. No longer standing. It was opened by William Park in 1850. The first steam engine operated mill in the county was implemented for this mill. People would travel up to 30 miles to have their grinding done at Park's Mill for this reason. It was operated by him until the Civil War, after which time he opened a large flooring mill in Sydney, despite continuing to reside in Urbana. Park had arrived in Urbana in 1849 from Greene County, Ohio, and was an extensive landholder all throughout the county, having interests in woolen mills and iron foundry, and in the manufacture of reapers and mowers. Along with Archibald Campbell, he built the Urbana and Champaign Street Railway. This railway was the first in Illinois outside of Chicago to connect the two cities. Next slide. This is the Urbana Seminary, also known as the Urbana Male and Female Seminary. It stood on the corner of Birch and Oregon Street. It was the first high school built in Urbana in 1855, initially established under the patronage of the Methodist Episcopal Church to provide good Christian education. However, when it could not compete with free tuition that was offered at public schools, the church sold it to the Urbana School District in 1857. It then burned down in 1872, with a new one being erected on the same site shortly afterwards. What was first known as the Third Ward School and Oregon Street School became renamed Leal School after founding superintendent Thomas R. Leal. After Thornburn School was built in 1856, Leal became a grade school exclusively. The original building was torn down and replaced in 1935, but bears the name of Leal Elementary to this day. There is an illustration of Urbana Seminary from the Bowman map on the left-hand side during its early days. And the archives are fortunate enough to have a book that was most likely used at that school, Pilgrim's Progress, which are the two pictures on the right. You can see the title page, which lets us know that this is an 1835 edition. And the second picture, that very faint blue writing, has the inscription, Miss S. Knoll presented as a prize for improvement in writing, female seminary. So good on you, Miss Knoll. Next slide. Now we finally get into those prominent citizens of Urbana who Bowman was kind enough to memorialize for us. John C. Kirkpatrick was born in Pickaway County, Ohio in 1825. His grandfather had been one of the earliest settlers in that state. As a boy, he was trained to work on the family farm, and he bought and shipped livestock with his father, James. He purchased a large number of cattle in 1859 and fed them on the farm of Colonel Busey in Urbana, upon which time he met his daughter, Mary, and they married very quickly. When they returned from their honeymoon in 1850, they purchased a 160-acre farm in West Urbana, where the couple oversaw the construction of the town's first frame house. Kirkpatrick and John Campbell filed the first land plat in 1853, which allowed him to become one of the largest landowners in the region, as well as establishing himself as a successful agriculturist through his connections with Busey and his superior quality of livestock. Due to his early settlement of the area, when the railroad came calling in the mid-50s, he sold 100 acres and city lots to the railroad. The Kirkpatrick family moved to Urbana in the 1880s, where he was in partnership with his son Jesse and son-in-law Charles, during which time they operated the Fair, a successful merchandise store located on Main Street. A member of the Methodist Church, Kirkpatrick and his wife were among the founders of the First Methodist of Urbana, where all their children were baptized, whether they be biological or fostered, as he and his wife were known to do. He died in 1889 with his second child, Albert James, continuing his agricultural legacy and becoming the sole proprietor of the Blue Mound Farm in Stanton Township. Next slide, please. No profile for John P. White, unfortunately, but that does not in any way minimize his contributions. He was a lawyer and businessman who owned an 80-acre tract farm along West Church Street in West Urbana. He contributed to the area under the firm name of Farnham, Clark, and White with his partners, who were Illinois Central engineers. This addition included a donation of 15 acres set apart for a public park, which became the first in the county in April 1855, 2 months before his marriage. It was known first as White Park in honor of him, although it was later renamed City Park and finally West Side Park, which is the name it retains today. The park is home to several footpaths, as well as a fountain entitled A Prayer for Rain that was sculpted by Edward Keames in 1899, and a bandstand that hosted prominent turn of the 20th century public speakers like Teddy Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan. Possibly at his partner's wishes, White was given sole credit for the gift on the monument erected on West University Avenue. Other notable instances of White's generosity included donating the sites where the Little Brick Schoolhouse and West High School were built in 1855 and 1868, the first two public school buildings in District Number 1 that competed with the seminary. Little Brick was torn down in 1893, with the new Central building on the same site being used for the next 21 years. West High, which was more expensive owing to its 3 stories and a basement, was destroyed by a fire in 1893. Next slide, please. And we have James S. Wright, the son of John Wright, a native Virginian who became prominent in Indiana before relocating his family to Homer in Champaign County in the 1830s. James left his father's farm in 1837 and went to work on the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which was then being dug between Chicago and the Illinois River. He returned to Homer with enough money to buy some land and soon became an independent farmer outside of his father's supervision. He began work as a county surveyor in 1838 and continued to do so until 1850. He helped to organize the first Sunday school in the county, and his first breakthrough as an entrepreneur was with MD Coffeen, a merchant who wanted to establish a trading center. This led to his involvement in founding the First National Bank of Champaign in 1865, for which he would serve as its first cashier. He got his start in politics in the mid-1840s when he served in the state legislature as a member of the Whig Party, leading to 2 terms as a member of the Illinois General Assembly, 1 for each house. He continued his political career locally by serving as the mayor of Champaign for 2 years. Next slide. Then there is Edward Ader, a famous early judge who is of greater interest, ironically, now, not for his judicial dealings, but for the miraculous story of his home. Ader came to Champaign County in 1830 with his father. 20 years later, he would be elected head judge of the county court, along with Tenbrook and Jones as his 2 associate judges. After serving as Urbana's mayor for 3 years, he was also the county board member responsible for building the 3rd permanent courthouse in 1861, thus assuring that Urbana would remain the county seat. When it comes to his home, he supervised its construction in 1857. 9 years later, he sold it to Francis Jakes, a lawyer, an early supporter of the Urbana Free Library and a railroad man. This passing of ownership would lead to the house being known as the Ader-Jakes House. Jakes was the owner and operator of the Urbana and Champaign Street Railway. He was involved in building the Eastern Railroad. He was responsible for founding the Urbana Building and Loan and the owner and operator of the Street Railway from 1863 to 1890, and for founding the Urbana Building and Loan. For the purposes of the Urbana Free Library, he and his daughter Minnie served 77 years combined as the library's treasurers. The original Ado Jacks residence was 2 stories with a 1-story service wing in the rear. 2 additional wings consisting of an office, a dining room, and a kitchen were added to the house in the 1870s. Jakes lived in the house until he died in 1896. In the 60s, the house was converted to commercial use, during which time a series of alterations were made that boded well for potential buyers, but very poorly for its future structural stability. In 1999, before the house could be moved to a new site, a section of the east wall suddenly collapsed, and the city ordered the immediate demolition of the house due to safety concerns. The library currently uses the site for parking. Next slide. William Nichols Kohler was an attorney, newspaper editor, and prominent Democrat in Champaign County for up to 2 decades. He came to Urbana from Ohio, like several other pioneers of the day. And the year after his admission to the bar, he became the 2nd lawyer to set up his practice in the town. His active practice mainly dealt with real estate transactions, and he entered into such an estate, 1,500 acres, when he married Miss Cordelia Sim. He and fellow Ohioan Henry Davis issued the first issue of the Urbana Union newsletter with Henry Davis in support of Franklin Pierce's presidential candidacy. The presidential support of Davis ironically led to the firm's dissolution 2 months later, when Davis went to Washington to accept office under Pierce's new administration. Kohler continued to run the Union alone through its 36th issue from its temporary location in the courthouse, at which point he decided to retire from editorial life. His next attempt at business led him to become one of the founding members of the Grand Prairie Bank, which was the first of its kind in the county, but failed due to the start of the Civil War. During the war, Kohler was commissioned by President Lincoln to organize a regiment in the county and adjoining territories. By early July of 1861, he had completed this task in the organization of the 25th Illinois Volunteer Infantry by recruiting from Champaign. Kohler had served in the Mexican War as a youth in an Ohio regiment under a later infamous Confederate cavalry officer named Colonel G.W. Morgan. He continued to be in command of this regiment until the fall of 1862, when he returned to Champaign, having earned the title of colonel like his former officer. Kohler moved with his son Bird to New York City in 1872 and established a successful bond brokerage business. Next slide. Charles A. Hunt was born in New Jersey, so a little further east of some of the other pioneers, in 1819, and he lived there until his father died when he was 13. He did relocate to Ohio, where he discovered his passion for education and received his medical degree at the Ohio College of Medicine in Cincinnati in 1845. 2 years later, he married Isabella Hopkins and began plying his practice across Indiana and Illinois before settling in Urbana. He had a brief stint in the pharmaceutical business as a founding member of a drug firm, which he ran like Kohler until the outbreak of war. In his short-lived political career as the mayor of Urbana, he took great interest in the growing college seminary project. He was opposed to the expansion of slavery and read voraciously in his spare time about the newest developments in politics, science, medicine, and surgery, publishing his opinions on them in medical journals and local papers, adding corresponding secretary of the Chicago Academy of Natural Science to his already lengthy list of accomplishments. During the war, he joined the Union Army as a surgeon for the 126th Illinois Infantry. He performed his duties ably throughout the first 2 years of the war, especially during the siege of Vicksburg, where he treated malaria and dysentery that were bred from the nearby Yazoo River. This constant exposure to the unhealthy conditions and work strain took their toll on Hunt, however, and he had to be moved from the regimental hospital to the general hospital for an illness he contracted from his patients. He died in 1863, soon after his wife arrived to tend to him. Isabella survived him for 50 years, with 2 of their sons, Joseph and Corey, becoming druggists as well. Next slide. Then there is Joseph W. Sim, selected to be the judge of the county court in the fall of 1873 and serving a full 4-year term until 1877. He was the third successor to the bench after Joseph Cunningham and A.M. Ayers. When he was 23, his family settled on a farm a mile east of Urbana, and after serving as principal of the village school for a short time, he studied law with William Kohler. Upon it being admitted to practice and forming a partnership with Kohler, the union was unfortunately short-lived when Kohler married Sim's sister and closed their law office to go their separate professional ways. After his term as judge, Sim formed a professional connection with Cunningham and re-entered civil service as the mayor of Urbana for 2 years, from 1864 to 66. He withdrew from practice shortly afterwards because of his ill health and insisted on farming and stock raising instead, dying in 1890. And that's all.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. I'll open the room to questions if anyone wants to ask anything, or else I have a few questions. Thank you so much, Ryan. This is a wonderful speech. And I never knew a lot of this stuff, and you know, I look at the Bowman map copy in our community room every day, so learned plenty of new things.
It's all that history is hiding in plain sight.
Any questions?
Yes. Ryan, I have a question for you. I know you said you did this as part of a practicum with the library and the archive. Did y'all consider putting this up as like a interactive GIS format, you know, as like a web interactive at all?
Sorry, say that last part again.
When when you were doing your practicum or as part of that for the library and the archive, you all consider the idea of like turning this into a map at all, so that people could like scroll through and it would either click on the spot on the map and it would pop up with like an overlay of the pictures and the information?
I think that would have been super interesting. That option was not considered because we knew that it would be a physical display in the downstairs cabinet,
Okay.
be displayed for a short time before another one took its place. This exhibit is available online. When you go to the library's website and you click to the genealogical archives, you can find it where it's published by Omeka. It's just that all of their past exhibits adhere to like a very straightforward format, and me and my supervisor Sherrie designed this to be in the mold of that. So as fun as it being interactive would have been, it would have, I think, stood out too much and been too complicated.
Ryan, this is Renee Potter. I have a question. On the homes of the prominent individuals that you spoke about, are any of those still standing?
I do not believe so. My main sources of research for this project were the Cunningham History of the County book, which was published, I believe, in the early 1900s, as well as just later maps, Google, and everything I found tracking the changes from then to now. Since all of the houses had their addresses and I was able to compute what the modern equivalents were, it seemed as though very nearly all of them are gone, unfortunately.
Okay. Was there anything interesting that you found about any of those houses?
Oh yeah, I think the
other than the Ader house.
I mean, the Ader house certainly had the greatest wealth of material. What was interesting about the houses wasn't so much their like ownership story in the case of Ader Jakes. It was that because they were both illustrated by Bowman and very clearly marked on the map, I was able to put together both how these houses looked, or even ideally looked, to a viewer who may not have seen them in person, and then where the spread was. Because a majority of the houses were very large, two-story buildings, to signify the wealth of these men, and also were I don't know if we can click back all the way to like the first picture, or if that's too complicated.
I can try. 1 second.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Forward 2 more. Yeah.
Here? Wait.
1 more. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So in this one, you would have to zoom in so much, but maybe we can get the clicker. If you look at the lower right-hand side of the map in that urban sprawl, that's most of where the houses are in that Urbana area, from the settlers and businessmen who came in the 1830s, pre the railroad, had these very large houses, as I said, with then a few others, some but not as many, being in West Urbana post the depot, to show off a newer form of wealth.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Ryan, could you tell us a little bit more about Alexander Bowman? I know you touched upon it, but I've read in a few places that he did have an office in the cattle bank and spent some time here. Were you able to find any more on his time in our historic building?
I was able to find some. The part of this project came about because the Champaign County Archives holds Bowman's diaries, and they have recently been digitized by the very good folks in that office, and I was allowed access to them. There is not, unfortunately, for my purposes, a page that just said, I created the map today and here was all of my input. It wasn't nearly cut and dry as that. They were donated by that descendant, Jim, many years afterwards. And what I learned about Bowman was a lot about his life once he left town. I learned how being this sort of somewhat itinerant, very multi-skilled guy from the East made him very good at doing a variety of jobs, but never holding on to those jobs very long. Being a cartographer in Champaign County was a fairly short-term gig that has been memorialized in these maps that we study, and in, I believe, a news advertisement that is mentioned in the text. Again, at the bottom of that map, you'd have to zoom in to see it, where it's Bowman, I believe, asking for no, he's not asking for an assistant. He's posting like his services to the town to let them know that he's arrived.
Oh.
And so his work would have come about that way. But yeah, he moved away to another part of the state that not too long after the 1850s, and did not continue with as many, like, his cartography to the same extent. And it was that one obituary that I had to go on to sort of fulfill the journey of his life.
I will say we had someone else in the chat ask a question that's not specifically related to your talk, so I'll just answer it briefly. Wendy, you asked if there's any connection between Urbana and Champaign and the Urbana and Champaign County in Ohio. And there is. We actually have an article on that on our blog. If you go back to, I think, 2018, we have an article on there that talks about that connection. So I would direct you to that because it's a very, very interesting article. And thank you for the question. I also have a question of how did it come about that this particular topic was something they directed you to? Was there something about the timing of it or the specific topic that they wanted to really highlight the Bowman map, or was it just a project they'd long wanted to talk about?
I think it was more the latter. I applied for the practicum back in, oh boy, let's see if my math's any good, the fall of 2021. And at that time, the exhibit that was either like had just gone up on display or was in development was about the history of hurricanes in the county. And I'd met with Danica about this practicum, and later Sherrie Bowser, the wonderful Sherrie who helped me so much on this. And the idea was just presented to me as what it would be were I to go through with the practicum. I believe their reasoning was that the map had been hanging up outside the office on the second floor. And because they had copies of it, it just made sense for an exhibit and for something they hadn't done yet.
One other comment I'll make is there was a question earlier from Renee about are there any surviving buildings from that map? We have done our own research at the Cattle Bank, and we've found that we are the only surviving structure on there that is in substantially unaltered form. So
yes.
So our own research has backed up yours. We have not found any other structure in any way connected with this map that is still in substantially unaltered form.
Okay, that's good. That's good because when you call something the only one, you want to be sure that you're right.
Yes. There are some buildings that were created just after, and structures, the railway bridge that's now in the Boneyard Creek Park, and obviously the Greek Revival Cottage in Urbana that are a couple years later. But no, the Cattle Bank is easily the oldest commercial building in the area. And I urge people to stop by the museum to see it if you haven't been in person. Are there any last minute questions? Otherwise, I think we'll say thank you for your talk, and we really appreciate you stopping by to talk to us tonight.
One more question.
Oh, one more question?
One more question. Does the library have a copy of this map in like electronic format at all?
They do, yes. In the, I can even like go to it right now. It was very, very important to me while I was doing this. In their holdings, you can just search Bowman map, and what you're seeing in the PowerPoint, that version will come up. And what's great about that is that that's not just what is hung up, but because it's been reframed, and this is available online too, it has this incredibly useful like historical context writing for the map that was the impetus for a lot of what I did.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate you all joining us on Zoom here or in the Cattle Bank proper. It's been great hearing the speech, and I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. If you would like to stop by the museum, we are open Wednesday through Saturday, and we urge you to come in, see the oldest commercial building in the area. You can also visit us on our blog. We have a series of historic articles that are available. So thank you all again, and have a great night.
Thank you for coming. You were a wonderful audience.